Tatworth Village. Chapter 5. Religious Bodies. Village schools in the 1800s have their teaching practice based upon learning by rote, in classrooms holding a number of other age groups as well. In most schools there was only one large room, which was cold, damp and dusty. Religious bodies, mainly the Anglican National Society, established in 1811, controlled the institutions. Church schools greatly outnumbered voluntary organizations, and all schooling required fees supplemented by donation and government grant. The education of the poor, such as it was ministered by the Church of England's National Society. At this time there wasn't any government provision or legal requirement. The provision of a school was dependent upon patronage and benefice of the rector of Chard Church, plus bequests and subscriptions. And only 5 years before, a parliamentary act banned the use of child labour, although it did carry on for a few more years. In 1837, Victoria came to the throne 1 year after the Union Workhouse was built on the Crewkerne Road. A further 2 years saw 243 people sheltered there from the town and borough. An out relief was a fund raised to help the unemployed. That year, a sum of £1,700 was allocated for that cause. The start of the century had seen harvests ruined by bad weather, and the lead up to the coronation was to see little improvement. William IV had been on the throne for 7 years, and now it was the chance to turn round the economy. Victoria was 18, and she was made of sterner stuff. One of the continent, 1830, was a year of revolution. England was up in arms, with serious rioting that broke out. Farm machinery was smashed, ricks set on fire, and fists were raised. The rain in 1828 had been the worst in living memory, and agricultural prices had dropped. And during the next 10 years, farmers formed a reduction in their rent. A few had to sell up and move away to the town. The lord of the manor, in a number of estates, gave land over to the community for allotments, and it was a bad time for all, particularly for the poor. There was much unemployment, for neither farmers nor workshops were taking on labour. The poorhouse in the town had to turn people away, and the mayor of Chard called a meeting where he put it to the assembled parishioners that the severe weather was creating hardship, and it was decided to make donations, and a collection was immediately taken which raised £60. The plan was to purchase coal, bacon and peas and share these out to 600 poor persons. The social gap was widening as the inefficient and uneconomic farmer sold up and the wealthy tenant and the lord increased their holding. Landowners had benefited from the purchase of low-price land. The industrialization of manufacturing brought to a head the scandal of child labour, and by 1844 the employment of any child below the age of 8 in the textile industry was banned. Between 8 and 13 the child had to attend school for 3 hours a day, and many parents evaded the restrictions where they could. Textile workers opposed the raising of the minimum working age to half-timers. Lay schools were set up to teach children to read. The commissioners later tested the children to find out what had been learned, and the results proved that although the children could read, the majority couldn't write. The Union Workhouse was still a necessity. Inmates were issued with a hammock, although it would appear that those were not in a very good condition. An issue of string gave some comfort to repair the netting and to ensure the hammock hung properly. 2 rugs made by previous inmates were all that were allowed for each person, and there were complaints about not being able to wash, and the violent disturbances resulted in 2 months' hard labour in the House of Correction. It was the large acreage now of the thrusting landowners that allowed them to survive the hard times after the Act of Enclosure, and once again the Paulets gained most. By 1865 horse-powered threshing machines had been installed, improved land drainage continued, whilst fields redesigned, both assisting hay farming to reach its peak by the end of the century. In 1866, J. B. Gifford, who owned and founded a lace manufacturing business at Forton, then moved to Holyrood Mill, forming Gifford, Fox and Company, and was approached to finance and provide premises for a co-op. This he did, with the additional loan of £15. This proved to be a very successful enterprise, although it didn't stay at the mill, but moved to 4 Street under the title of Chard Industrial and Providence Society. The shop's staff was in the main local people. To them came Thomas Dolling as a 12-year-old errand boy in the year of 1879, and it was he and a Chard Board pupil who was not only accomplished at school work but also diligent in the shop, and within 20 years he had risen to become the head of the co-op. And for the next 40 years he stayed and directed the operation, taking it to great heights. Tatworth boasted the building and consecration of a daughter church to St. Mary's of Chard. This became the Mission Chapel of Tatworth in September 1851, and at that time still considered a hamlet. When built, it was consecrated by the Bishop of Jamaica, the foundation stone being laid 3 months before in June, with much approbation. The chapel built on 1/4 acre of land donated by the lord of the manor, Earl Paulet, together with the necessary stone and £50 towards the church, total cost of £1,040. All previous churchgoers from Tatworth attended St. Mary's Church, Chard, which was short of seating for the poor, even as far back as 1827. And years later a gallery had been erected, but the church still lacked accommodation. Those worshippers attended St. Margaret's Chapel of Ease in South Chard. Tatworth Village School was built in 1872 in the same early English style as the church, built some 20 years before, and together gave the village a new status. Tatworth was now recognised as a separate community from Chard and became a parish in its own right. 30% of the population was aged 14 or less, and it was deemed highly desirable to have a local school. The new school was built of local flintstone with brick coins around the windows and doors. 2 gable ends faced the road, separated by 2 lean-to aisles and a front porch. 2 sets of steps mounted the pavement, 2 arched wooden doors which led into the cloakrooms, and topping the whole lot was a bell tower whose ringing bell called the children. The pupils were mainly from homes whose parents worked at the mill or creamery. They all knew each other or knew of each other. It was that sort of village school, and very few lived at a distance, and most walked or rode a bike. Living opposite the picture of the school was taken from an upstairs window of Rosalie Cottage that gave the Collins children an even greater sense of belonging, not just to the school, but to the community as well. When the school day was over, all the children came out in succession, the youngest first, making the otherwise deserted road alive with their shouts and calls. It was a happy place, remembered fondly. They were all oddly dressed, especially the younger ones. Their chatter was joyful, if rather quaint, not in the least embarrassed by their local patois. the boys in their caps and the girls' hair tied up in ribbons, skipping along in their pinafores. The majority would come from poor homes, but that doesn't explain how they were brought up. The village was in the main a God-fearing place, its inhabitants low church, rigid to behaviour and set in their ways. The boys and girls who lived at the other side of the village, near the railway station or Chardstock, used lane, path and short cut to reach home, and along the way they could usually find some stick or special find to show off with, betting each other that theirs the greater find and couldn't be bettered. It was the boys who liked to find a stick to make a bow or make pretend sword, catapults or pipe. The girls, who kept well away from the nettles and briars, were the authority on what could be eaten safely, or which leaf could make a better print. They chatted and giggled, keeping to their own little group as they weaved their way past the cowpats, refusing to take notice of the boys, who by now were carving their name on the beech tree. Their pastimes, games, hobbies and interests are little different from those played generations ago. The boys kicked a ball or tin, and the girls skipped, played catch or hopscotch. The same the world over. The difference are those that are forced upon them by local authority or government edict. Their clothes less tattered these days, fashions changed too, but childish behaviour remains the same. The bullies demand subservience and the meek consideration. The confident were heard and the shy tried to hide. That, after all, was the way of the world. The village was lucky, having the mill and creamery, with all their ancillary trades, giving training and employment to its inhabitants. The Chard road station and sidings gave employers the means to import labour and transport goods, and both the warehousing sheds and ironmongers provided all those ancillary pieces of equipment necessary to support both these firms' engineering shops. 10 years before the school was built, education standards were linked to student results under the revised code. There was an annual examination, an attendance record kept, religious instruction and needlework for the girls. Specific subjects grants for history, grammar and geography were brought into being in 5 years later in 1867, which raised the number of subjects, giving a broader curriculum. These subjects became class subjects 8 years later, and shortly before a number of other subjects were included: Latin, mathematics, science, modern languages and domestic economy, cookery and gardening. And by the turn of the century the curriculum as we know it was in general use, and not long afterwards payment by results ended. Child labour under 8 was forbidden. 6 years later the employment of children on farms was not allowed in a group less than 10, even though 8-year-old children could be employed if they had attended school 250 times during the preceding year. However, all the laws passed to regulate labour were widely evaded. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 to 1873 compelled child authorities to ensure that there was adequate provision, to establish a child board school. The cost of the board was met by local taxation. Church-aided schools had to rely upon voluntary donations, topped up by donations from local gentry. The board schools provided national elementary education for over 2 million children. There was made a universal curriculum which had to be followed, and secondary education didn't have the same encompassing system until the school boards tried to instill order, and eventually the Education Act of 1902 ensured the basis of all public education and lasted until the Education Act brought into being by Rab Butler in 1944. My mother started school at the age of 4 in 1912, Academic standards in the board schools still didn't rise sufficiently even after the 1902 Act set out targets levels of Standards 1 and 2. Standard 1 required an ability to read from a textbook, including words of more than one syllable, dictation, writing down a few common words in a neat hand, and the ability to add up and subtract not more than 4 figures, and the recitation of the multiplication table up to 6. Many children didn't reach even this low minimum standard, and it's unfortunate that teachers resorted to harsh methods to improve their standards. Village schools at the turn of the 20th century laid great emphasis on the principles of Christian religion, morals, reading, writing, and the casting of accounts with beads. Some pupils went on to grammar schools. Girls were accepted into the village school but not allowed into the grammar. The grammar school curriculum consisted of Latin grammar and literature, history and geography, and to some degree a little Greek. The scriptures were essential, so too arithmetic, mental and addition, diction and manners given special regard, along with national heroes, marching, some games and physical exercise considered fitting in short measure. Boys attended 6 days of the week and church on Sundays. Those parishioners who valued education, the ability to read and write and reckon, were usually those who could afford to do without their child's labour for as long as was necessary, and those folk were tradesmen, yeoman farmers, and yet lesser gentry. And when the school boards were put in place, it was to those citizens, those unable to afford individual lessons by tutors and public schools, they were planning for. The school's inspectors noticed in both town and country the bad treatment of school children. The nation's children were from this time forward going to be educated, and the payment of teachers by results had disappeared by the time Elsie went to school. Although the children in Tatworth had the benefit of education in a new school, operating a regulated curriculum, they still lacked the cultural benefits available to town children. 8 years before, the Board of Education defined elementary education as forming and strengthening the character of children and developing their intelligence, assisting boys and girls to fit themselves for the work of life, and girls were expected to be self-sacrificing, domesticated and moral, boys to be hard-working, loyal and brave, and both extolled as children of the empire. The nation was proud of itself, believing that there was further noble deeds to be done. The empire was supported throughout the country. Heads of rural schools not only maintained discipline within the school, but were sometimes expected to control the behaviour of their charges outside as well. In many outlying hamlets, sending older children to school was looked on as wasteful labour. When my mother, Elsie, went to school in 1912, children were being given cocoa or some other warm drink for a penny during the midday break. The local nurse still discovered dirty heads during a school inspection, and teachers were always taking care that when children scratched, they were inspected for lice or flea bites. Inferior meals at home caused some of the children to be undernourished. Giving free school meals afforded the school the opportunity to instill good manners and proper eating habits. To eat properly with a knife and fork was a full-time job. A dentist travelled from school to school, checking the children's teeth. He carried out inspections whilst the children were sent out to play. Cheap spectacles were obtained free of charge, and instruction given about the correct way to clean one's teeth. The health of the nation's children had become a national issue, and initiatives were started to improve the general rate of health and other child welfare matters. The Roundtree Foundation highlighted the serious physical deterioration amongst the poorer sections of the community in their 1901 publication. The First World War evened out the vast differences between children's health in good and bad areas by government inspection. And every day began the same for all children. At the turn of the 20th century, most working-class families expected their children to contribute to the running of the household. Tasks were learnt by following their parents round the home, helping as they went. The boys took on the heavier work, whilst the girls helped with sewing and food preparation. Water had to be brought from the stream. Each day had its routine of household chores, and all this work had to be done before going to school. It was expected that Elsie and her sisters helped their mother look after the chickens, fetch the eggs and clean them out. The washing had to be mangled, hung out, turned and then dried. When dry, ironed. The vegetables were gathered from the garden, washed and put away for the next meal. There was a half-time system at the mill. Children over the age of 10 could work limited hours whilst receiving their education, and this continued until after the First World War. After the war, the troops were dismissed and returned home. They might have been informed by letter that the village had changed, or they might have seen for themselves a few of these changes when they were sent home on leave. However, it was a different thing altogether when they had to face the changes day after day. Younger people were not content to put up with things that had gone on for centuries. They wanted to sample the so-called good living to be found in the towns and cities. Women, too, had seen for themselves their sex working on the land, and others had gone to work in factories. The industrial age had started the decline. The First World War had carried the momentum farther, shattering the old ways. Things were never to be the same again. It was not just that the working class had to adapt. The upper classes, particularly the large landowners, lost their sons, who were going to take over. So working arrangements at the mill continued, but not for long. Children still worked at the mill, crawling under the looms, with bare feet to stop slipping, to retrieve the ends of broken threads. These ends had to be instantly repaired in very hot and damp conditions to quickly get the gliding jennies back into action again. They felt proud they were contributing to the family's income, as they felt the sixpence in their pockets. The children of farm workers also turned their hands to the work in the fields, picking up stones, weeding the crops, and collecting potatoes. No child of the poor was allowed to get away from working for their keep. The bell on the roof tolled at 9. It seemed very loud, and the pigeons scattered at its sound. The noisiness of the children greeting friends subsided, and the running around stilled. Lines were formed outside the door, and all waited for the teacher to admit them. No talking was allowed, and each child allotted a seat, and after the girls put away their pinnies. Any late-comers received a black mark, and this was entered in the term report. The roll was called, whilst attendants were ticked off in red. All the Collins children went to this school. There was no escaping either the building or its influence. It was built, after all, opposite Rosalie Cottage. Prayers and hymns started the day, always the well-known favourites learnt by heart. As the scholastic subjects were reinforced by repetition, them in rhyme, intoned in a sing-song fashion, it was an unchanging ritual going back generations. Classes started at 9 o'clock and lasted until 3:30 every day. These went on until she was 14. The school hall divided by a large curtain which didn't reach the top of the pitched roof, one side for the younger children, the other side for the older. The sun's rays, finding a gap in the curtains, penetrated the dusty haze, created a spectrum on the opposite wall as they passed through the glass, normally drawn back for morning assemblies and special occasions. A trained, certificated male assistant teacher received £100 per year. His female colleague received £10 less. Teacher training colleges insisted upon a strict religious calling for their student intake. They must be free from all faults. It was about moral ascendancy over literary knowledge. It was not always the case that properly trained teachers filled the vacancies, for acting teachers, who were usually the brightest girls in the final year, were preferred. Heads considered that they understood their jobs better and had an empathy with their charges. Elementary teachers were uncultivated and imperfectly educated, commented one chief inspector. It was not unusual for the local squire or magistrate to require school teachers to attend Sunday school, play the piano, and organize out-of-school educational trips without payment. The first and second year children followed the seasons with calendar records noting when the first snowdrop showed itself, when the first cuckoo called, and the first swallow flew. The class would be given the task of drawing these, and the best ones displayed on the wall. All the younger children and newcomers used slates and squeaky slate pencils, and approved lessons like English and arithmetic checked by the local authority. Scripture was compulsory for all, and once a week the vicar would come to talk about moral behaviour, told in the form of a story. Country children were taught to observe and appreciate the countryside and local history, sometimes by a village elder, and when the class was considered capable, they were given lead pencils and told to copy letters of the alphabet and words from cardboard specimens. The next stage, after obtaining the correct standard, exercise books with faint green lines were passed out, and were to copy off the blackboard simple sentences. This carried them to the next stage, linking sentences together to make paragraphs. After the 2 years, the class graduated to the use of pen and ink, and every day the ink monitor would pass out the filled china inkwells, placing them in the drilled holes at the top of each desk. It was found difficult to control the ink at first, or even to make a pen work at all. The nibs had to be clean and the points not splayed out or crossed by too much pressure, and when a new one issued, blots and smudges appeared as if by magic. Sleeves and hair sometimes got in the way, but these hurdles were soon overcome, and the class settled down to perfect their copperplate writing. Less pressure on the pen for upstrokes, and the firm pressure on the way down. There was always a controversy whether strokes down should follow directly on top of those going up instead of making a loop. It was considered important by school authorities that drill superseded random gymnastics. The class was told to march, swinging their arms forward with the opposite leg, in military fashion. All the arm and leg movements were to be done in correct order, following an accepted pattern, so that each exercise was known in advance. Every muscle had to have an approved exercise, and running was strictly regulated. If the day were particularly cold, then marching, swinging the arms, hopping and coordinated exercises were followed all round and round, folding and unfolding like a snake. There was never enough space for games and no equipment provided. Over a year there was sports day, when all the classes did their exercises before their parents. There were 3-legged races, egg and spoon and sack races, throwing the beanbag and catching the ball. All the children had to bring an enamel mug to school so that lemonade could be served out, and there were iced and currant buns provided by the school authorities. Prizes were won and achievements recognised, usually in the form of a book. Music lessons consisted of practising singing the national anthem, the national songs of each country making up Britain, and popular patriotic songs and folk songs. This involved much practice, which was taught using the tonic so-far system, using a tuning fork to start on the right note. The whole school marched into the playground to salute the flag and sing all the songs practised on Trafalgar Day, with an emphasis on why it was so important to have a navy to protect the country and its trade. After the First World War, Armistice Day was observed, when once again the whole school assembled to salute the flag and observe the 2-minute silence with the flag at half-mast. National and Saint Days were celebrated, flying the Union Jack and the flag of St. George a prerequisite for all organisations and groups. Empire Day considered the most important national event next to the King's birthday. Patriotic songs sang and tales of daring do, exploration, discovery and invention read aloud and cheered, and all these national events were celebrated during the Sunday church service following on from the school. My mother and her class were taken for country walks where the names of plants and trees were written down and the local wildlife pointed out. Collections of grasses, leaves, butterflies and other insects mounted and named. Records of when certain things happened throughout the year copied down, and older children made up their own sketchbooks, which were initialed and coloured up. Prizes were presented in the hall at the end of each year, and these were mainly books. There were 3 teachers taking different groups called standards. Infants were taught to knit dishcloths and to patch holes and darn. Elementary dressmaking, buttonhole stitching and pleating was also taught. Reading considered especially important and frequently checked by the school inspector. The quality of writing using correct English, neatly formed geography, history and nature study, needlework, cooking and gardening. Most pupils had long hair, plaits or ponytails. On leaving school, hair was put up, either in a bun or braids round the head or draped either side below the ears. Where possible, in large families, most of the clothes would be hand-me-downs. If these were not available, they were purchased at bring-and-buy sales or made by mother, except shoes and hats. Generally the dresses were of checked gingham, knitted socks and cotton knickers. Winter wear, usually navy skirts attached to a bodice, with hand-knitted jumper, knee-high socks, brown lace-up shoes, knitted woolen vest, a Liberty bodice and buttoned down the front, an assortment of other buttons for holding up suspenders and knickers, and in extremely cold weather, fleecy knickers were worn with a pocket for a handkerchief. Nothing was ever wasted in the clothing line. Discarded clothes cut down, shortened, taken up, patched, darned, cut into squares for rags and worn sheets turned inside out, middle to edge, or made into pillowcases. Worn pillowcases became handkerchiefs, liners, or tea towels. There was no end to the amount of make-do and mend necessary to look after a large family. All families had a rag bag, the contents useful for repairing or making up patchwork quilts and mats. Only outside buildings was the coal shed and the row of lavatories in the playground. They contained the wooden seat over a bucket that was emptied each week by the school caretaker, who also provided the torn-up newspapers on a string. There were lessons on health and hygiene, the importance of washing hair emphasized, as was brushing teeth, cutting nails, and what was good to eat. The importance of bathing, the girls were taught how to look after babies. However, there was no lessons on sex. Girls were instructed on how to look after and run a home, and this was linked to sewing. The make-up of curtains and covers. Boys were instructed how to dig, why to dig, how to plant out vegetables and run a greenhouse. There were talks on how to avoid common ailments by a local nurse who cautioned about practicing old country remedies, dispelling superstitions and tales of false beliefs, especially about the menstruation period. Some children smelled strongly, and no one wanted to share a desk with them. Much of the nurse's talk was trying to make children aware, without spelling out the truth, that children sometimes wore underwear all the year through, and this shouldn't happen. There was neither school milk nor lunches. Sandwiches were eaten at the lunch break. There was always water from the tap in the playground, and the eldest children didn't finish until 3:45 to give the infants and their mothers time to clear the front entrance. Those children who had an elder brother or sister to take them home had to wait inside. The rooms were well lit because there were such large windows set into the gable ends. In winter it was always cold due to the high ceilings. 2 large round stoves heated both ends of the room, and however much the stoves were stoked, it was never sufficient to heat the corners. The floor was bare boards, which gave off clouds of dust whenever there was any movement, particularly when there was morning assembly and for the dancing class. Infants were taught to knit with 2 needles and then 4. Darning using a wooden mushroom, how to turn, hem and take up and gather in, how to sew on buttons, make floor cloths and cover buttons, and taught fraying out, removing each separate thread from a patch of material and unpicking, unravelling an old woolen garment, were methods used to provide material to make up something new. Sewing bags made, and each girl's initials graced the sides. These were end-of-term tests and used by the teachers to keep one class quiet whilst the other in the room carried on with their reading and writing. Material was supplied by the council, always white cotton, and from this articles of clothing were made, pillowcases and nighties. Patterns had to be traced suitably for the child's size. There was a communal box of thimbles, needles and thread. Embroidery with coloured wool made simple samplers. A school inspector of the day noted that a number of children had died through diphtheria. The winter always brought the usual bout of illnesses: whooping cough, mumps, chicken pox, scarlatina, diphtheria, scarlet fever, colds and influenza. The school's medical officer had to be notified, especially if an outbreak, and these problems affected the standards of education. Special lessons were arranged for children to catch up with lost lessons, and regular attendances by the doctor and nurse to inspect for medical examinations and general cleanliness. Doctors Forsyth, Koch and Daniel came from Chard surgeries, as did Shepherd, Weaver and Geely, the dentists. If there were any problems, the parents were visited to check that action had been taken, and heads were examined by the nurse for nits and general health. Proper clothing and shoes for winter wear identified, reported and logged, and there was no aspirins or cold remedies. Antibiotics not long discovered, and infections spread by contact. In the early 20s there was a national epidemic of mumps and illnesses. The senior classes had to fill in nature notebooks, mostly by personal observation, making sketches and writing explanatory notes. It was encouraged that everyone should be observant and know what to look for when each season arrived. Poetry was used to promote a good memory. popular writers of the day discussed and passages read out. On speech days, prizes would be distributed for every subject, as with national songs, poems, and noted authors. These works committed to heart, to the extent that they could be remembered all through one's life. In rural areas, in the early 20th century, most children left school at 12 to start work. The Education Act of 1918 raised the age to 14. The school's inspector noted that arithmetic was not a strong subject, but that the discipline was good, and the child attentiveness to their lessons was excellent too. In the early afternoons, before the youngest children poured out through the main school door, shouting and screaming, their mothers did the shopping and made courtesy calls, pushing their coach-built second-hand much-used prams containing the latest edition. It was a time relished by the mothers, knowing that their peaceful existence about to be extinguished. They remembered their time in the same school, sometimes even the same teachers. The layout of the schoolrooms recalled, the smells and sounds the same. There were brothers, sisters, cousins, and even more distant relations, mingling with friends made many years before, all doing the same lessons in the same manner. After school, my mother roamed the woods and fields with her sisters and brothers in search of birds' nests and fruits of the hedge to take home and present to their mother, which might stop her complaining about their torn clothes. She was strict, which was necessary considering that at 37 she had 11 children to look after. Her life was a constant endeavour to make ends meet. Gentle, devoted, strong-willed, worshipping respectability and constancy. The children played hide-and-seek and red Indians, leaping the streams, climbing the trees, collecting bluebells in the wood, and constructing bows and arrows. Mum would be wearing her pinny and hair in ribbons, her brothers corduroy knee breeches and a jersey. They would search the hedges for suitable sticks to make into pipes, whistles, catapults and pea-shooters, spud and pop guns, bows and arrows, lances, swords and daggers. The vibrating blade of grass held between thumbs made a whistling noise when air blown through. Owl hoots produced in the same way, but without the grass. Betting each other they could whistle louder or longer, children still trundled their hoops, bowled marbles, tip, cat, and skipped, drew hopscotch chalk lines, spun tops and constructed cat's cradle. Girls played their singing games, joined hands and skipped. Here we go gathering nuts in May. Jenny Jones visited, oranges and lemons chopped off heads, and what's the time Mr. Wolf tempted giant paces. The big ship sails and the farmer wants a wife gave everyone a chance. Throwing a ball against the school wall, clapping hands while spinning round, sevens or swappings, marbles or cigarette cards, all games played at school. Conkers were strung in the autumn and daisies threaded in spring. All the children in the village went to Sunday school, whose numbers had been built up since the chapel had been erected, thus enabled a choir of boys and young men to be formed. The morning service followed on after the school, and the choir was used as a means of teaching basic music to the children, and would make them keener to continue attending. Occasionally there would be special services for a christening, Saints' Day or Mothering Sunday. The annual Empire Day was celebrated using paper hats previously painted in the Union Jack colours. Patriotic songs were sung, stories of Daring Do, Cecil Rhodes and Captain Cook, atlases perused for its pink areas and places of British influence. It was a day for rejoicing and celebration greatly looked forward to. The organist, who doubled up as choirmaster, religiously struck to the few hymns, ancient and modern, which were well known and practised. It was a way of ensuring that there would not be any embarrassing silences or mumbled verses. The church brought together all the various elements of the population, cementing the community together, and whether the day wet or fine, the music of the choir gave the stark interior a softer touch. In the winter, the cold seemed to be far more intense. Clothing was not so efficient at keeping the cold out, and often children had chapped hands and legs. Some cried when their hands started to thaw out while standing around the coke brazier. Many of the children reached school having to stumble over rutted ground and frozen field, still wearing ordinary shoes worn by much use, and usually from being passed on from older brothers and sisters. Sometimes the soles would be so thin that studs and blakies would not hold into the leather. Fortunately, the Collins children lived opposite the school, didn't suffer these setbacks, and this was about the only positive aspect of having the school so near. My mother told us that her reading was done mostly in bed by the light of a candle, and during the evenings before going to bed, time would be filled by knitting in front of the fire, resting her feet on the logs set before the fire. Her sisters would embroider, make spills, rolling up strips of newspaper, make dolls' clothes and Christmas presents, kettle or iron holders, gloves, pincushions, handkerchiefs, sachets, lavender bags, padded coat hangers, peg bags and tray cloths. Many of these would be crocheted or contain crocheted borders. French knitting, using a cotton reel with looped wool over the pins, made a long cord that could be tacked in the round to make mats. A useful present could be made from sewing mothballs in red silk, providing leaves cut out of thick felt to represent holly. A hanging loop of plaited wool would ward off moths in the wardrobe. Dishcloths were knitted from heavy cotton yarn, face flannels from old cut-down towels, and old dresses made aprons, rugs, patchwork quilts and sacking doormats. Cardboard cutouts were decorated with coloured paper, stuck on with flower paste to make theatrical sets, were some of the pastimes which contributed towards passing long winter evenings. Her brothers designer pokework, using red-hot skewers spliced into wooden handles, cut jigsaws out of thin pasted pictures, and interlaced wooden spills to make mats. Along with the harvest revels, Christmas Day and Boxing Day were the other two great occasions for the whole family. Both these were holidays celebrated by everyone, although the animals still had to be looked after. Holly and mistletoe, the only decorations, were draped across the top of pictures and laid across the ceiling beams. Carols were sung, and everyone singing one verse on their own. Party games enjoyed, and simple presents unwrapped. The children went to church 3 times on Christmas Day, and on each occasion they enjoyed a special meal, the highlight of the day's events, all served with parsnip wine for the elders. The church choir did the rounds, and the children knocked on doors after singing a carol. Neither New Year's Eve or the next day were marked by celebration. It was back to work with a vengeance. Amongst the children who left school in the 20s, there were a few who went on to higher education. Some of the girls took up nursing or teaching, the only 2 positions which required training for girls. Those who were to become pupil teachers could stay on at school to teach the youngest children and pick up some of the skills necessary for teaching. Trainee nurses might be taken on in hospitals if they were near enough, and both positions were underpaid, receiving less than the lowest paid worker. Women teachers and nurses in training couldn't get married, having to leave if they did so. As a bright 13-year-old from a lower middle-class family residing in the country, father, perhaps a self-employed artisan with a flourishing business employing others, the track to become a teacher would be as a class monitor to an uncertificated teacher, teaching the first induction class of about 50 children. If he proved capable, he would be offered a formal indenture as a pupil teacher. The first hour of every day was put aside for instruction. You would be also expected to take an annual examination for each of the 5-year-old apprenticeship courses, when then proceeded to a teacher training college to take a 2-year course. After 1903, the starting age for apprenticeships was 16, and you were paid £2 per annum. Their title was pupil teacher in a 4-year course. It is clear that a national scheme was still a long way off. The observance of one scheme rather than another depended on the local authority, whether it was a board school or attached to a religious body. There were no unions or tribunals. Working arrangements were strictly adhered to. Pupil teachers had to attend county classes twice a week. This continued until the Second World War had been underway for a couple of years, and then the emergency of all-out war made such rules irrelevant. The training for both skills took until the pupil was 18, then earning about £1 at 16p per month. £1 usually went back home to mother, and the rest on lodging and keep, leaving very little left when the college course undertaken for full training. The county council paid any travelling expenses, and this was the only grant. Books had to be bought, and college fees had to be paid by the parents. An oath had to be taken by pupil teachers that they would not work out of the county for 2 years after qualifying. It also meant that the now trained teacher couldn't get married until after that period had been completed. Some children were bright enough to sit for a scholarship examination when 11, and then go on to a grammar school. However, there were so few places that extra cramming had to be contemplated. School uniform, books, sports equipment and satchel all had to be bought, and the fares paid for train or bus. It was quite impossible for workers' children to think of such treatment. If the child was to go into trade, he had to think of an apprenticeship. There were no such schemes for girls until the late 70s. An employer had to be found to take on a lad, and there were many who wanted the chance. Most trades took 5 years to become fully trained, others took 7. The parents had to pay the employer a fee for the privilege, which might be several £100s. This often meant the boy had to leave the village and find lodging, and at the end of his apprenticeship he would have his papers stating that he was fully qualified. He was then likely to be taken on as an improver at the lowest possible paid rate for at least the first 3 months, by which time the employer would be in a better place to judge whether to take on the worker at all. If taken on, it would take several years to be accepted as a fully trained worker, and then, and only then, would he receive the going rate for the job. An alternative was to work on a farm, as a lad, to pick up the skills of a land worker. This may be looking after animals, helping repair walls, ditches and fences. Alternatively, as a carrier's boy, delivering. Other employment could be found working for the local estate, as a park gardener or in-house. Girls usually stayed at home under the watchful eye of mother, perhaps making lace, straw dollies, or making garments. What is interesting is that women were more adventurous than men, and that those women it was the younger who opted for urban life, and more often than not to live in service. It is clear from census figures that economic and social developments since the latter part of the 19th century have confirmed that women were attracted to town life, if It only needed the stimulus of a shortage of men in the workplace to attract women from the home. Each of the wars in the 20th century have contributed to this trend, and by the time the First World War was over, women had seen a complete change in social cohesion, and this was the start to the breaking up of class structures. The numbers of men killed and maimed, particularly the officer classes, was felt by the gentry, who were looking forward to getting back to pre-war standards. Inheritance taxes completed.